how I recommend you watch this video is that you just put it on as background noise and listen to it whilst you're performing some more visually intriguing task, because there isn't much visual to this edit right here. So naturally, I think that's how you'll get the most enjoyment. But if you want to watch the visuals, that's fine by me. But either way, I hope you enjoy the video, and let's get into it after the intro has played itself out. I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for a brand new discussion based video on the channel of this here Skylanders. So around the community recently has been a bunch of videos uploaded by several different SkyTubers discussing their favourite Skylander for every game. So I'm going to take this concept and twist it a little bit. So rather than talking about my favourite Skylander of each game, I'm instead going to collaterate all of these particular Skylanders of an element together to discuss what the best overall elements are in each of the games, as well as the worst, in my opinion. So naturally, that's where this video gets its title from. We are discussing the best and worst elements from every Skylanders game. And of course, we're going to, when we talk about each game in order, start with the worst element and work our way slowly up to the best, because I want to end off each game on a high note. So that brings us to the original first ever Skylanders game released back in 2011, known as Skylanders Spyro's Adventure. So you can find the best elements on this side and the worst elements on this side. Regardless, when it comes to the worst elements, there were a few in the line in this game. Water, for one, has two amazing characters and two mediocre characters, because in my personal opinion, whilst Gilgrunt and Zap are excellent, well-rounded, speedy projectile characters with a lot of power, making them naturally very destructive and very fun to utilize, Slam Bam and Marshall, on the other hand, were slow, not nearly as powerful as they needed to be classed as fun, quote-unquote. Then there's also the magic element, where Voodoo is amazing with some very unique movement options. And Double Trouble is also incredible, with a very unique design and very distinguishing personality, bringing a lot of charm to the character. But unfortunately, there was Wrecking Ball, whose design was really weak and gameplay that really grossed me out. Like, seriously, burping, that to me is disgusting. And on top of that, Spyro, despite being the name of the game, was very lackluster. Like, seriously, guys, he has a fireball and a charge. It's not really all that creative. You know, most have took him about 2 brain cells to come up with that moveset, which is highly underwhelming for such a well-esteemed character. But moving on from that, we also have the Undead element, which has 2 absolute fan favourites in it, because, of course, you know, for our third honourable mention here, that being the Undead, which is where the 3 fingers comes from, there's Chop Chop and Ghost Roaster in that element, which are 2 very well-designed characters. They have very distinguished and very memorable designs and some incredible gameplay on top of that, with some really great animations, some really great pacing work from both of them, and better yet are our sound effects. You know, Ghost Roaster laughs and chuckles, which is terrifying to match his design, and Chop Chop, whenever he's walking, has his clanking armor and all. It just further invests you in the world, really, with the realistic sounding effects coming from the game, oozing from the game, you could say, to be more grammatically interesting. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's Cinder and Hex, which unfortunately are slow. Their projectiles aren't nearly as powerful or as speedy as they need to be to, again, be considered as fun. So naturally, their designs really let me down. And Hex's figurine is awfully designed. It's incredibly fragile. That can lean to breaks and damages far too easily. So they clearly didn't think her through when they made the figurines so easily to be broken, especially as Spyro's Adventure, which was improved over time, don't get me wrong, but we're looking solely at Spyro's Adventure here, where Hex wasn't all that good. But this brings us to our 4th and final mention, since this is, in my opinion, the worst element from Spyro's Adventure, and that's going to be the air element, which is a big surprise coming from such a well-designed element. Like, seriously, we have a turtle on top of a tornado, we have a griffin, a lightning god, and a unicorn blended with a dragon. This is easily one of the greatest designed elements from Spyro's Adventure, which is also ultimately what makes it the most disappointing, because the gameplay for none of these characters lives up to their figurine. With Lightning Rod, you have powers which are fun to utilize, but not nearly as powerful as you'd expect coming from a lightning god. Like, seriously, you pick up this character and want to play as him because he looks so overpowered and broken. But he's none of that. He doesn't really live up to what you expect, and ultimately because of that, it becomes very unsatisfying. And Sonic Boom is great out of the box, since she's really powerful and has her babies right out of the bat. But unfortunately, as you get through her upgrade chamber, she doesn't really get much better. Her attacks deal a little bit extra damage, and her animations get a little more interesting. And apart from that, her upgrade chamber is an absolute waste. So the fact that she doesn't really go through an arc for her upgrade chamber and doesn't really improve, again, makes her quite forgettable, unfortunately. And then Tornado's gameplay just straight up sucks. His movement is terrible, there's a huge lack of agility, and that makes him incredibly slow-paced and not very fun to utilize. And Whirlwind, her gameplay is just mediocre. You have rainbows to heal Skylanders. That makes her easily the most useful character, but not the most fun. The only motivation you have to play with her is that one ability where she, of course, uses those rainbows to heal up other characters. Because of this, she doesn't really feel as powerful due to this ability, and then needing to balance that out with her attacks not doing as much as they feel like they should. So naturally, none of these characters are phenomenal. I would say Tornado's the only one who I don't like out of all of them, but really 3 average characters and one I don't like exceeds an element like Water that have 2 meh characters and 2 great characters. But now we get to move on to the other end of the spectrum with the best elements. So honorable mentions here go to the Tech and Earth, since both of these elements have 3 amazing representatives. From Earth we have Dynarang and Bash, which are absolute fan favorites, and it's easy to see why. I mean, we have probably the most balanced character in the game with Bash, since rather than a useless fight ability, he instead has a rock projectile, a very powerful melee attack, and a speed-based attack to make up for any lack of pace he could have otherwise. And Dynarang is a dinosaur with boomerangs. You don't really need to get you don't really need to go into much more explanation than that to explain why he's awesome. Just dinosaur with boomerangs. I think that has done my explanation justice. But Terrafin and Prison Break are a bit of a divide for most people. Some people love Prison Break and hate Terrafin, like yours truly, or they love Terrafin and hate Prison Break. That's why there's such a divide, because with me, Terrafin is a bit too slow, not nearly as powerful as he needs to be, and awfully paced, whereas Prison Break is constantly invested, and he requires a lot of brain power, a lot of strategy, as you have to reflect your lasers through his crystals, is what I'm trying to say here, and that constant investment in his gameplay makes him really fun in my personal opinion. And in Tech, whilst Drill Sergeant does exist, he is an incredibly lackluster design, and attacks are slow and not nearly as powerful as they need to be, meaning that you're only really playing with this character for 70% of the time he's on the portal. The other 30% is bloody reloading, and that becomes really frustrating. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have Tree Happy, full of personality and character, and it's incredibly fun to play as, because you're just mashing buttons the whole time, and it gets so insanely paced and fun. And then there's also Drobot, who's stupid overpowered. His attacks have incredible range, incredible rate, incredible power for said rate. And then on top of that, he has some amazing movement that's really fast-paced and fluent, and an incredible personality too, and some of the best voice acting of the entirety of the series, because they, of course, edited his voice to sound just like Soundwave from Transformers, who is my favourite Decepticon character. So, of course, that reference, even whether it's intentional or whatnot, is incredible to notice as a Transformers fan. And Boomer is easily one of the most overpowered characters straight out of the box. Now, he does have similar problems with Sonic Boom, to where his upgrades don't really improve upon his base, because his base upgrades are so overpowered as they are already. But it's still better than Sonic Boom. He still has aesthetically different attacks and much more power compared to what he is straight out of the box. So that makes, for 3 great Tech characters and 3 great Earth characters. So why are neither of these elements at the top spot? That's because Fire exists. Fire is by far the best element from Spyro's Adventure, because for every single one of the 4 characters, I can name someone who would call them their favourite. We have Sunburn, who I believe is the favourite of Scarlet Beale, Flameslinger, who is the favourite of Drop 28, and Demigod Schmurder, then Eruptor, who has Bombo 3, and yours truly, who has Igniter. This is a perfect, well-rounded cast with characters that have really high power and melee ability, as well as strategy behind them to keep you constantly invested in their gameplay. as well as incredible designs all around, some great power, some great speed, some great range. So no matter what you're looking for, chances are you will find it with the fire element. Even for worst, for weak link or for sunburn, to me, is still a pretty well-paced character, and he has an incredible design too. For reds and the yellows contrast each other sharply, and the blend between a phoenix and a dragon is pure genius. And I don't think I even need to explain about what makes Igniter such a perfect Skylander, giving this element an overall score of an 11 out of 10 if I had to, rate it, so to say. But now we get to move on to Giants, and when it comes to the worst element in this game, it really pains me to say this, but it's fire. Not because Hot Dog and Hothead are bad by any means. No, far from it. I think they're average at best. Sure, Hot Dog is cute, but his attacks are kind of generic, a somersault, a flame wall, and a fire breath. That's a sarcastic clap right there, because it doesn't take many brain cells to come up with that moveset now, does it? And then Hothead has some really unique gimmicks to where, he can create an oil slick of lava rain and a flamethrower and then ignite the oil slick. So that makes for some, really intriguing strategy once again. I quote that because it's not really strategy, you're just pressing one button and then the other. But the main thing about Hothead really is his movement options. His motorcycle, whilst being fast, has no turning capabilities whatsoever, no agility. And it's far too hard to initiate. The attacks it's mapped to are just ridiculous and beyond frustrating. So that means that the two fire characters are unfortunately average, and that's worse than for elements I have for honorable mentions here, because for honorable mentions, aka for water, earth, and tech elements, have one great character and one bad character, and that, is much better than just two average characters, so to say, because for better character and the worst character kind of even each other out. And so tech, we have Bouncer, who's incredible, some great movements, especially for a giant, and some really creative attack patterns. But then on the other end, there's Sprocket, who's far too weak and far too slow with her attacks, leaves herself far too exposed, making it very inefficient combat. And then there's also Earth, where we have Flashwing with some incredible melee projectile attacks even, and some great power to go alongside those, and some great pacing. But unfortunately, there's also Crusher, who's not really as powerful enough as he needs to be for his to compensate for his large hitbox and slow movement speed. And then for Water, we have Chill, which personally I love more than most, because I find her projectiles really fun and really chaotic. And Thumpack, who's, again, just like Crusher, far too slow and not nearly as powerful as he needs to be. And just like Wrecking Ball, he has a really disgusting attack where he just throws up all over the place. It is disgusting, and it gives me a really big distaste for the character. Again, same as Wrecking Ball. But we're going to waste no more time getting into the best element from Giants. And I've got to say, comparing these elements together is really, really difficult, because there's only two characters to take into account, for Giant and the Core. Because when it comes to these games and for characters that I'm collaborating together to, create my overall thoughts on them, are based solely on the characters introduced into that element by the game at hand. So with Giants, for repos and for light cores, for example, aren't really included towards my summarization of these elements here, which is why Fire got the short end of a stick and wound up on the worst list for Giants. But moving on to the best element for Giants, we have Undead and Life in for running, because Eyebrawl, Fright Rider, Shroom and T-Rex alike are all amazing characters, with Eyebrawl and T-Rex having some amazing power to truly capture the scope of their characters. And then Shroom is also really fun with some great movement. The fact that you can launch fungi and they go flying all around the place is similar to Trigger Happy's moveset, so because of that, it has the same satisfaction. And Fright Rider has some amazing pacing and some great animations that are really powerful and very satisfying on a visual level, which is why I like him more than most people. But still, none of those elements live up to the magic element. You guys heard that right. Ingenie is a good character, you guys just don't know how to play with her. If you press the combo button, she does a spin, which is much, much faster with her sword strikes, rather than just tap, tap, tap. If you know the strategy of Trigger Happy is to mash a button and just do the same with Ingenie, you'll realize how much better she is. Just because Crash doesn't like her, doesn't mean that you can't like her. That's my advice for the day, guys. Have your own opinions, think for yourselves, because Ingenie not only has fast and powerful sword strikes, But her bottle form makes her gameplay fresh, and because you're constantly swapping between the two forms and never really repeating yourself when it comes to her attack patterns and everything, because you can use her bottle form, circle around enemies whilst launching rockets, and of course tranquilizing gas to stun enemies with, and then of course exploding from the bottle to create some very satisfying visuals. So overall, she's far more fun than people let on, and far more powerful too. But there's also Pop Fizz, which is for one Skylander I can confidently say that everybody loves. It's basically fact at this point that Pop Fizz is really good because, you know, you can mix up his potions so that you have different strategies for different scenarios. You know, you can use purple bottles, orange bottles, green bottles, and you can even combine these bottles together for chemical reactions. It's a very thoroughly thought through, fun and fresh moveset, and it's fresh for the same reasons as an Ingenie. With the beast form on top of that, you're just constantly playing differently with a character in different scenarios, and because you're never really playing with the same strategy twice, it never feels stale or repetitive, making Pop Fizz and Ingenie alike both great characters, making the magic element without a doubt the best that Giants had to offer. So now we get to move on to Swap Force, and when it came to Swap Force, it easily has one of the best original casts. We have 32 characters like we did back at Sparta Adventure, 2 swappers and 2 cores per element. And so naturally, water is one of those elements which is just good, and Swap Force has that many great elements in it that just good isn't good enough. Sure, Freeze Blade has a really awesome design and is really fun to play as, and you could say the same for Punk Shock, but Riptide is mediocre, you know. His attacks aren't very balanced, so the only strategy with him really is to stick with the Hammerhead because it's so much more better than the Swordfish. So because of that, you don't really play the character as the developers intended, for you to constantly swap in between weapons, because instead one is so much more effective than the other, so you don't wind up using the other, which winds up becoming very disappointing and very unsatisfying to play after a while because it's very tedious and repetitive and boring. And Riptide on top of that is also slow and very poorly paced. And then there's Washbuckler, who has the same problems. Like, sure, he has his dash attack, but with the Soldier ability, if you start mashing with dash attack, you go into a spinning animation, which really does waste time, and it's not that effective either, because it's not all that powerful. And then Washbuckler's top half abilities certainly are better than that. The bottom half are more intriguing, but they're also quite generic, like a Sword Strike and a Bubble Gun. Again, didn't take many brain cells to come up with that now, did it? And the Sword Strike isn't nearly as powerful enough as it needs to be for the lack of range and just how slow it is. But still, the worst element of the game is not of the water, because instead it's of the earth element, which is a huge disappointment coming from Sparta Adventure and Giants, where they were, for the most part, great elements with great characters in it. So Swap Force coming out and having Rubble Rouser, Doomstone, and Slobbertooth all in the same element was so disappointing. First of all, Slobbertooth is very forgettable because he's far too similar to that of Bash, so the two designs kind of amalgamate themselves together in a way, confuses you, and come the end of it, the only design you wind up remembering is Bash because he did it first and he did it better. And then Rubble Rouser and Doomstone, well, Rubble Rouser is just another rock golem. Even in the Swap Force days, we'd already seen that with Prison Break and Crusher, and he has a hammer too! Where is the creativity when you're comparing Rubble Rouser to Crusher? They're effectively the same character even when it comes down to the gameplay, meaning Rubble Rouser shares the same flaws. He's not really as powerful enough for as little range he has, and he is far too slow-paced to be of any fun. He just becomes repetitive and tedious, and Doomstone is no different. His attacks aren't nearly fast nor as powerful enough to warrant for lack of range, but at the very least, he is better than Rubble Rouser. And there is Scorp, which definitely, you know, savors for Earth Element somewhat, because Scorp is one of the best characters in that game. Just like Bash, he has a great balance between range, melee, and speed, making him overall a very well-rounded and very fun Skylander to utilize, because again, you never use the same strategy twice with him, so you're constantly varying up your gameplay and having a lot of fun whilst doing it. But now we get to move on to the best elements, which, let me tell you what, this was very difficult, because as I was alluding to at the very start, there are so many great elements in this game. You know, you have the air element, where the only real weak link for me is Scratch, who's not nearly as good as people let on, because you have Popthorn, who can inflate and deflate himself. Same dealer as Pop Fizz, where it's constantly fresh and different, the gameplay style you go for, and that makes him really fast-paced and really fun. And on top of that, he's a cute Skylander that's actually cute, both in-game and out of it. So I adore that. It makes the character have just so much life and charm to it. And even Scratch, whose gameplay is quite underwhelming, is still very awesome on a design standpoint. The reference to Egyptian culture is really unique to her and makes her very distinguishable. So at least she's memorable, to say the least. And then on top of that, you have Boomjet and Free Ranger, who are two of the best Swap Force characters. Free Ranger has the range and the speed, as well as the powerful melee attacks. And Boomjet, likewise, he has a really awesome personality, a great design, and he has, you know, the speed for range and for, melee aspects to him, but really with the exception of his bottom half, which isn't nerfed in Imaginators, which makes it all the more motivating to pick up and play as. Is really what makes Boomjet so great. You know, he doesn't need melee attacks to round him out because he has those powerful projectiles and the fast-paced nature of the rest of the character already. And on top of that, there's Undead, which Roller Brawl is a really underrated favourite of mine. She's fast, she's powerful, and she's really balanced above all. Then Grim Creep is also really fun and powerful and great for all the same reasons as Roller Brawl. And Rattleshake and Night Shift, once again, are two of the best swappers. Night Shift has the additional life system, a system so good that they brought it back for Imaginators with the guest star Crash Bandicoot. And then Rattleshake also has a lot of great range. He's also really easy to just pick up, play, and have a ton of fun with, because you can just spawn in a baby snake, and then, you know, whilst they're slowing down enemies, you can finish them off with a charged up snake. And it's awfully ironic watching a snake fire off a snake for his gun. But that's still not the best element. Neither is Tech, despite the fact that Tech has Magna Charge, Spy Rise, Wind Up, and Countdown in it. All of those characters are expressive, unique, full of personality and character. Great designs all around, and are very effective in game with a range of great projectile, melee, and speed-based attacks to ensure some great maneuverability, some great combos that are really fluent and fun to pull off together, especially on a visual level. And then on top of that, they also have great knockbacks, so that's what keeps their efficiency and their momentum running. But they're still not as great as the fire element. Even with the weak link of the element, Frino is a character that's very personal to me because, you know, when I was younger, I had a lot of temper problems. You know, I lost... I got very angry very, very quickly, you could say, and Frino is a character I can relate to because of it. Because Frino gets mad, he pounds the ground in rage, and then, you know, he can just bring out this massive motorcycle, which is better than our hotheads because it's more maneuverable and far more easier to access. So naturally, you know, that makes Frino well designed, personal to me to invest into. And then on top of that, we have my second favourite Skylander of all time, Smoldered Ash. Man, she is good. Like, sure, she's nothing but blocky black when it comes to her colour palette. But apart from that, the moulding on her design, her speed, her variation, and her gameplay just makes her so fast-paced and so damn powerful. How can that gameplay tell you otherwise? Then there's also Firecracker, one of the best Swap Force characters based on his design. Sure, his gameplay is a little lackluster compared to his design, but it's still very effective. You know, you can use the fireworks to draw an enemy straight in front of you and then finish them off with his powerful melee attacks, and the actual power of melee attacks justifies the short range on it. And Blast Zone is easily one of the best Star Pack characters. He has that speed from his charging abilities, then he also has, you know, his bombs, which he can power up with his flame breath, you know, encouraging a lot more experimentation with his moveset is the word I was looking for, because of course, you know, you can't just mash the bomb button. Instead, you find yourself using a range between the bomb attacks and the flame breath to combine the two together to create the most efficiency in gameplay. Sorry for the mad lighting and camera angle change. I had to stop for recording there because I was talking too darn long and used up all the storage on my phone. But regardless, we're going to jump right into my favourite Skylanders game without further ado, Trap Team. And one of the main reasons why it's my favourite Skylanders game is because it has such an awesome cast of character. character? That's not plural at all. Trap Team has more than one. In fact, it has the largest cast of new characters of any Skylanders game, because truth be told, we don't only have the 4 from the 8 base elements, but we have 4 brand new characters spread over 2 elements for new, light, and dark. And speaking of light and dark, all I can say for the dark element is that unfortunately when it comes to this game, it's one of the worst. So naturally, going back to what I was saying before I kind of went highly off track, Trap Team is one of my favourite because it has such a great cast of brand new characters that are introduced to the fray, a lot of which are underrated, especially for cores. But when it comes to certain elements, however, the Dark one included, they are lacking in characters. The Dark element, for example, only has Nightmare and Blackout to its name, which makes it kind of unfair to compare to other elements, because 2 in comparison to 4 just can't really be considered even in any way whatsoever, because without the extra 2, there's no way of knowing whether these elements are worse or better than others. Like, if Dark had 2 additional characters, who knew what those 2 additional characters could have been? They could have been just as great or as bad as other characters, mind you. So that's why Dark is just being let off with an honourable mention this time round. It's like getting a yellow card in football. It doesn't really mean anything. And actually that's just because Nightmare and Blackout are not my absolute favourite characters to mess around with. They have awesome designs, and it definitely elevates the element as the entirety, known as one of the best designed elements in the game. And it also helps that Blackout is fun to an extent. He's also incredibly broken, and I don't mean that as in an overpowered way. I mean that as in he literally bugs out the game. If you defeat an enemy whilst being transferred between his black holes, he makes the enemy indestructible, basically. So whenever you find yourself needing to defeat all the enemies to advance, that becomes impossible, simply because you just happen to defeat an enemy whilst they were stuck in your black hole. So naturally, the glitchy, unfinished nature of Blackout's gameplay can be really frustrating, and with Nightmare, despite the epic design, her movement is terrible, leading to bad pacing, and a poorly executed damage stacking ability, which is great in concept, horrid in execution. I get that she's a boss killer, but on easy difficulties, she's defeating bosses far too quickly for the damage stack to do anything. And on a harder difficulty, she's dying too fast anyway, because she has no movement and too large of a hitbox to be dealt with, so she's not balanced. So again, it's like getting let off with an honourable mention because we don't know what the other 2 characters could have been, and comparing 2 to 4 is not a fair comparison. It's like comparing apples and oranges. But moving on to traditional base elements, there's only really 2 to mention here, and the first one of which is fire. Believe it or not, the best element is once again being mentioned amongst the worst for this cast of characters. And whilst there is an absolutely incredible fire Skylander that was introduced in this game in the form of Wildfire, a Skylander in my top 10 characters. He is so beast, so broken, so well designed. But apart from him, there's Torch, who's really fun as well. You know, her attacks get really destructive and really satisfying. But Trailblazer and Kaboom, on the other hand, they don't really fit in. They don't blend well with either Skylanders. They stick out for all the wrong reasons, because their designs just aren't cartoony enough and just don't look like they belong. They don't feel uniform to me, and design is important to have the right feeling behind it, and for those characters, they just don't. On top of that, their gameplay is kind of generic. Kaboom is kind of like a mix of Bouncer and Hothead, and Trailblazer just has like a fire charge, a fire kick, and a fire blast. Even for a fire elemental character, that is really lacking in the creative department. So naturally, 2 for 2 in Trap Team, despite how great Wildfire is, Wildfire alone isn't enough to elevate the element for me. But it's still not as bad as the magic element from Trap Team, because, oh boy, we have Deja Vu, who is great. I really like the fact that she is based on French culture, based on her colour palette, her hairstyle. The naming alone really tailors back to the French word and the meaning of the word in French origin and all. And that makes her really fun. She also has a really distinctive and unique moveset. But then there's also Cobra Kadabra. Now, I do not mind this character is what I'm trying to say here. He has a nice rhythm to his gameplay that keeps him invested, but he's just another snake, and we've seen that done already, and we've seen it done better with Rattleshake. He's a snake in a basket. Big deal. They could do better than that for a Magic Unknown's character of all things. Oh wait, I forgot the flute. That makes all the difference. Not really. But then we also move on to the Trap Masters, which are two of the worst of the cast. Blastermind is terrible. His attacks are weak. His figurine is awful because it's just too thin. It's not satisfying to grip in any way because it's awfully textured. And then Enigma, whilst having an amazing design, his gameplay is awfully slow, not nearly as powerful as it needs to be, making him very lackluster when it comes to his gameplay, and he's just not that fun because of it. Neither is Blastermind, so naturally that's what makes them two terrible Trap Masters, and is what makes Magic the worst element overall from Trap Team. But now we get to move on to the best elements from this game, and we get to start off with a light element, which once again is only an honourable mention, because if we were to get two more light characters to make the comparison more fair, who knows if those two characters were going to be any good or whatnot. But the two we did get were phenomenal. Nightlight is so brainless and so broken. You can just mash buttons and practically win every single time. His life bar is huge. His attacks have massive knockback. So either way you spin it, Nightlight is effective and fun. You see all this destruction happening on screen, all these pretty little colours, and you have the satisfaction of knowing that you have won, causing all of that glory. And then Spotlight, she's an absolute lock saviour. When I did my ultimate Dragon Lock for the Skylanders Trap Team, she blitzed through it. Her beams are powerful. They have the same strategy behind them as Prison Break with reflecting and all, and that keeps you constantly invested in her gameplay. She's really fun, and she's just full of character too, and her design is really unique, having, rings carved out of the wings. It just gives her a really unique mold and just helps her differentiate herself from the rest of the dragons. So she's broken, she's well designed, and she's full of character, same as Nightlight. You can't really fault that. So if only there were more light characters, so that then we could stop comparing apples to oranges and instead compare apples to apples. But moving on to other great elements from the game, you also have the life element, where the only real letdown for me is Tough Luck, because her attacks don't hit nearly as hard as they should. Bushwhack is really fun with his attacks, however, they are as powerful as they need to be. He's an absolute tank, although that's really all that he is. He doesn't evolve himself beyond that purpose, so to say, so that can be quite disappointing. If you want, to play as Bushwhack with anything other than offense, it's just not going to happen because he's offense and offense only. Then Food Fight is, of course, really fun, as is High Five. He's really well paced, though unfortunately he's a little too fast paced for me, because every single time I press the circle button like 3 times, he always seems to do an extra dash, which can really throw me off. So sometimes his speed can be a bad thing, but those circumstances are few and far between. So if it wasn't for Tough Luck, life could have easily been the best element. And then you could say similar things about the air and Undead elements, because with the air elements, there aren't really any terrible characters. In fact, Blades is one of the best of the game. He's got a really awesome design, amalgamating a dragon and a knight, which is highly ironic because in folklore, of course, knights slay dragons. So the dragon being a knight who's doing the slaying is just a really clever twist even. And then Fling Kong is also really fun. You can just, mash buttons and throw his frisbees anywhere, but that reminds me too much of Trigger Happy, and because of that, Fling Kong kind of becomes very forgettable. I'm even surprised that I'm calling him by the right name, because most of the time I call him Fling King rather than Fling Kong by accident. And he's just a pure rip-off of Aladdin, so his design isn't great either, and I hate his movement as well. It's lacking in agility, unfortunately. Then Gusto is an absolute beast. He's just dumb, stupid, broken, as Demigod put it, in the Soul Link debut. Check that out. But enough of the self-plugging right here. Thunderbolt is also... he's fine. He's not the best Trap Master, but he has some powerful melee attacks, which are balanced out by his, clouding abilities, which are more ranged. As you can tell, I am kind of forgetting about Thunderbolt as I'm talking about him, and that's purely because his design is very similar to that of Wildstorm, but Wildstorm takes the design and expands upon it, makes it even better. So naturally, because of that, looking back at Thunderbolt, there's very little to remember. So that's my main problems with the air. And then we move to the Undead, where the weak link, to be frank, is probably Batsman, despite the fact that she is still incredibly OP'd, and Funny Bone is just full of life and character, and is really fun to play as. Then Shortcut, likewise, he has a massive weapon for such a short little body, and that's incorporated into his design, because he has, scars everywhere from, I assume, his own scissors, his own handiwork, you could say. And then Crypt King is also just dumb, stupid, broken, the same as Gusto. Like, seriously, he has a swarm that stuns, that does 92 damage, that has lock on, and that heals him. He's ridiculous, and I love him. And on top of that, he has that awesome Egyptian-inspired design. Love it for the same reason as Scratch. And yet there's still one element that's better than for a lot of them that I've mentioned so far, and that is the tech element. That's right, finally tech has become the best element of a game to be mentioned, because we have Gear Shift, one of the most balanced, fast-paced, fun characters utilised in the entirety of the cast. We have Jawbreaker, who has quite possibly the best soul gem in the history of Skylanders. That hypercharged haymaker is an absolute lock saviour, and I love it. And on top of that, he's very well-paced and very balanced with his, of course, Robo Rage mode. Then Treadhead is also really well-paced, some great movements, some attacks that flow together really well. And Chopper's not only cute, but he's also dumb, stupid, broken, with a very destructive soul gem that's so satisfying to take advantage of. So yeah, needless to say, the tech element is the best the Trap Team had to offer. They absolutely nailed the tech characters this year round. But moving on to Superchargers. Now, Superchargers, once again, is a difficult game to compare the elements between, because just like Giants, there's only 2 per element to consider, because whilst we weren't considering reposes before, for revamps I have taken into consideration, which puts our worst list starting off with the water and earth elements, because they have amazing revamps. Sharpshoot, Terrapin, and Deep Dive Gilgrunt are both powerful, expand upon the designs in amazing ways, and are most importantly really, really fun. But unfortunately, their new characters of those elements, Smash Hit and Dive Clops, are too slow, not nearly powerful enough, lacking in movement, and are awfully paced. So unfortunately, I just don't like those characters enough to elevate the element as a whole, despite how great those revamps were. Sharpshoot Terrapin, of which was a massive improvement over the original Terrapin, which, as I've alluded to already, I'm not the greatest fan of. But still, neither of those are as bad as the Undead element, which, just like Giants, actually, linking back to that, the Undead element doesn't have a bad character within it. It's just that both of those characters are average. And once again, with the Earth element and the Water elements, they have one great character and one terrible one. Well, not even terrible, just not great. And so naturally, those even each other out, and it makes 2 average characters for worst overall that game had to offer. Because Bone Bash Roller Brawl is a big disappointment over the original Roller Brawl, which, as I mentioned already, I love. She's just not got that same speed and pace into her, and she's not that much of a powerhouse anymore, because she has more projectile-based attacks, and her melee aren't nearly as powerful as they were before. And all they really did to improve her design is give her some sort of bone armor, so they can incorporate a put into her name that had an alliterative property. Yeah, Bone Bash Rollerball doesn't really work for me. And when it comes to Fiesta, he is phenomenal on a design standpoint, okay? The attention to detail on that design is so admirable. But then his gameplay kind of sucks. It's generic. All he does is summon amigos and, toot his trumpet to a similar rhythm to that of Cobra Cadabra. And on top of that, the attacks aren't very powerful, making Fiesta not very efficient in combat. He dies far too quickly because his attacks simply do not deal enough damage. But enough of pounding my own fist into the ground. We're going to move on to the best elements from Superchargers. And I'm also including guest stars from their respective elements as an inclusion on this here discussion, which naturally means that in the running, we're going to start off with honourable mentions. So Magic, Air, and Tech, keep the guest stars in mind for when I talk about best element, because when it comes to these elements, High Vault and Double Dare Trigger Happy are of course amazing. High Vault has a huge variety of moves which chain together very, very well and are really fun. And then Double Dare Trigger Happy has, a cannon, which is so fun to mess around with, and he maintains that fun button mashing, fast-paced gameplay from before, as well as the character and life that the original version had. And I do kind of like his coat as well. He's looking awfully stylish, so it really does improve upon the original design, giving him a little more than just, an orc with massive ears and short arms and legs. Then when it comes to the air element, not a huge fan of Hurricane Jetpack myself, though I can agree that it is an improvement over the original Jetpack, just because, Sword Blades are so much more cooler than blasts of air. But Stormblade, on the other hand, is so fast-paced. She's an absolute speedrunning demon and has a really fun design too. I love the sharpness of her blades. It makes her look really attractive, and you really want to play as her because she just looks like a badass character due to said blades and the sharp, texturing. Like all Skylanders, it's sharp, but not too sharp to where it's actually dangerous to play around with physically. And then the magic element, Splat is also incredible. She has some variety in her moveset to keep her gameplay constantly fresh and different from every scenario that you utilize her in. Her design is also really epic, and on top of that, she's really visually impressive with all of her different paints and everything that she lobs, making her really fun to not only play as but to watch as well. But all of these elements pale in comparison to, once again, the fire element making its third return. With good reason. Lava Lance Rupture is very fast-paced. It, improves upon the original design tenfold with a lance and a biker helmet. He really feels in uniform with a Supercharger's cast. He really looks like a biker, so I love that amalgamation of a biker-type design with, of course, Ruptor's volcanic properties. And then Spitfire is a perfect starter pack character because he has some great melee attacks, he has some great speed to him, which is great for a game that's all about speed. And on top of that, he's also visually impressive as well. His combinations look awesome. And then there's Hammer Slam Bowser. Remember when I said guest stars were going to come into play? Well, this is why the fire element is as great as it is. Hammer Slam Bowser is incredible. He is the perfect amalgamation of his rich Nintendo history and the Skylanders style put together. Okay, his shell is so well textured. His expression is so full of character on his figurine, and then in the game, the fact that his hammer can ricochet Koopas everywhere, and then he can turn into this massive Giga formation. It's so incredibly cool to watch, so fast-paced to play with, and it just makes Hammer Slam Bowser such an incredible character, in my personal opinion. Rounding out the fire element, even without Hammer Slam Bowser, fire still would have been the best element, but Hammer Slam Bowser just comes in and makes it once again another 11 out of 10 element, just like the fire element from Surprise Adventure, ironically enough. So now we get to move on to the final game, and start off with the worst elements as per the norm. The only real honorable mention I have for you is the magic element, purely because Pinata is a really fun character with some really powerful moves that are very satisfying to utilize, but unfortunately he's not much of a boss killer. So when it comes to him having to defeat bosses, he's very slow with that and not very fun in the slightest. So unfortunately that does make Pinata a huge letdown, despite how colourful his figurine is, how well textured it is, and just how much fun it is to play around with. Then Mr. Cat is one of my most surprising characters because it turns out he's full of character. His moves are really powerful with that perfect blend of range and power to make him balanced and really, really fun on top of it all. And then there's Buckshot, who's really disappointing. He has an incredible design, but his moves aren't nearly as powerful enough as they need to be, and he's just so slow-paced of a character to where he becomes dull and tedious to play with after a while. So that's the disappointment behind Buckshot, and even more disappointing about Buckshot is that his variant got cancelled, and it was so awesome too. But moving on to the best element in this game. So first of all, there's air. I've already mentioned about how epic Wildstorm's design is, and his gameplay is no different. He is overpowered, and it's so satisfying to just wreak havoc on your enemies, and of course say in the deepest voice possible, Wildstorm. And then on top of that, we also have the life element. So unfortunately, in this case, the guest star that is counted towards the overall element is actually the letdown in this element, because Crash Bandicoot, his health is too low, his attacks don't deal nearly enough damage. Sure, they combo together very well and make his moveset flow and feel fluent to it, giving it rhythm, but not pace, because he's so slow-paced. And because his attacks are not nearly as powerful as they need to be, his health is low due to the life system. You find Crash Bandicoot dying far too frequently. That can become very frustrating, making him the weak link of the life element, especially when you compare him to Boomblue. Ambush, and Chompy Mage, which all have that same flow to their moveset styles, but at the same time they have that OP nature. Chompy Mage was an absolute savior in my Imaginators Soul Link with Demigod to once again self-promote my own content on the channel within this video right here. Can't get enough of that. But then Boom Bloom and Ambush, their attacks just, after one has finished, you can so easily chain into another, and it's so satisfying. It keeps the rhythm and the pace constantly moving forward with those characters. They are really fun. They have really great designs too. You know, Ambush's armor in particular, and the small little increments and carved into his wood, his face and his arms and all, are just presenting a really awesome character in general. That leads us straight on to our final honourable mention, the tech element, which got really close again. Dr. Crankcase is probably the weak point here. You know, he's fun, he's just not nearly as fun as the others, which is just about all I have to say about that, because man, are the others fun. Chain Reaction has one of the best designs, scratch that, the best design of any Skylander. Like, seriously, a chain made of bicycle gears, and then, you know, chainsaws as his swashbuckling type weapon. It's so cool. It's so distinguishable, yet at the same time so in uniform and cartoony enough to where it still fits in with the Skylanders cast, unlike Trailblazer and Kaboom, which were sore thumbs when compared to the rest of them. Of course, his gameplay is unique, and that makes him even more distinctive because he deals damage over time rather than big chunks at once. But at the same time, that makes his gameplay slightly less engaging because, you know, you're not worried about mash and burns, you're just worried about getting one hit in and then getting out of there. And on top of that, this also means that he deals far less damage and is far less overpowered than other Sensei, so you're less encouraged to play as him in the game. But then that leads us on to Robo, who's not only overpowered, who not only has attacks that chain together so well, but on top of that, he's just pure fun. He is one of the most Skylanders. Well, he's one of the Skylanders even that I have the most fun with, to be more grammatically correct with the statement I am trying to hereby say. So Robo, huge amount of fun, worth the price tag because his design is epic and his gameplay is so fast-paced and fluent. I love it! I love it! But enough of my high-pitched squeals. We move on to the best element from Imaginators, which carries over from Superchargers. Very funny that our Superchargers and Imaginators both have the exact same worst and best element, because Imaginators is getting fire again. We have Ember, who has an amazing design. Like, seriously, she's a freaking samurai. I'm an absolute sucker for samurais. I love Japanese culture, so Ember taking advantage of all that really tailors herself specifically towards me, and so that elevates my opinion of her tenfold. And on top of that, she's also really fun with attacks that combo together really well. Unfortunately, she is slow-paced and by far the weakest when it comes to the gameplay elements of all three of these characters, because Tycoon Crow is just full of personality. He's so unique and engaging on a personality standpoint. And on top of that, his gameplay is also phenomenal. Being able to throw shurikens like mad, creating giant shurikens, giant buzzer beats to just wreak absolute destruction is impressive on a visual level and so much fun to cause such destruction. I know I've been saying this a lot, but I'm just truly emphasizing my point. The more destructive Skylanders are the more fun ones, and Tycoon Crow fits into that perfectly, as does Flare Wolf, again another Skylander within my top 10. Ironic how every fire element within my top 10 has wound up, you know, getting their element mentioned in this video. I was about to say in the best, but then I remembered Wildfire from Trap Team was on my worst list. Thank you for reminding me of that note before I awfully humiliated myself. But moving back along to what makes Flare Wolf such an amazing character, he has that giant bazooka, which is just so cool. And on top of that, every such destruction, okay? It has everything, every situation it has for range, for speed and knockback, as well as for melee, for whenever you need it, meaning that you constantly variate your gameplay or strategies, and that keeps the character constantly being fresh and avoids repetition and dullness, making Flare Wolf a bit of a wild card based on his personality as well, which is also incredibly invested, same as Tycoon Crow. So without a shadow of a doubt, Fire was the best element in Skylanders Imaginators, and rounding out Fire with not even three because I can't count right, 4 wins from the games. And even when it was in running for the worst from Trap Team, it still, it still managed to clutch it out and stay away from being the worst from that game, with Wildfire, the top 10 representative of that element from that specific game. Quite a combination, that. But we are going to be ranking all 8 base elements here, so of course for worst there's going to be magic. It got mentioned for most in the worst category, and it only barely managed to clutch out Giants just because it had 2 great characters in it, and it just so happened that they were better than the Undead and Life that were right up their tail. So again, those were much closer than you could possibly imagine. And then coming after that is Water, which very rarely came up on the worst lists, even as honourable mentions, but it also had the same problems when it came to best list, either very rarely being mentioned for that as well. So Water is very much a meh kind of element. It's not like Magic, where it's for the most part below meh. Water is just meh. Then we have Life next up at number 6, which I know is a fan favourite element for loads, but for me personally, I think it's kind of average. It has a lot of really great characters and a lot of really terrible characters as well. And once again, it didn't exactly manage to get anywhere. It didn't get on any of the worst lists, but none of the best ones either. Then we have the Air element, which got in the honourable mentions a ton for the best and got very, very close with Trap Team and Swap Force alike. And it very rarely came up on the worst spectrum of the list as well. So again, that's what makes Air such a well-rounded, such a fun element to mess around with. Then Undead comes up next, which got very close to the best list once again in Trap Team and Swap Force. Those games absolutely nailed that element, and it makes it so that element was great all round, even if there were stinkers from Supercharged and Imaginators. In fact, if those 2 games don't exist, Undead would definitely be number 2. But moving on to number 3, we have the Tech element, which I know is a fan favourite of many. It has so many overpowered, creative, and fun characters to utilise, and Trap Team was definitely the greatest example of this, with cute, speed, efficient, well-designed characters all around. But number 2 is going to be Earth, an element which didn't get on the best list. It did get on the worst list, however, but the worst list is an anomaly, because after Swap Force, it wasn't really mentioned, really. Like, sure, I got the honourable mention for Superchargers and Giants, but they were long runs, they were long shots. They would never get on those lists because they had just such great characters to even out from the bad ones, mind you. So there are characters so high up on the spectrum, so great, and there's also some characters which, even at the very bottom of the element standards, are still slightly higher within that low tier of characters. I wouldn't personally Earth Scarlet below D tier. They are all of that incredible. But of course, the best element is going to be Fire. Okay, I've mentioned already, I'm going to mention it again just because I can, that it won 4 times round. Spire Adventure, Swap Force, Superchargers, and Imaginators. Just because Imaginators no, just because the Fire element, once I speak correctly, has so many inventive, ingenious, awesomely designed characters that are fun on a gameplay standpoint, overpowered, speedy, balanced, most importantly balanced, and even for worse characters like Boom and Trailblazer are still characters that I have some sort of liking for, whether it's their design, or certain elements of their gameplay still having some sort of efficiency to them, because Trailblazer is still a powerful character. He still gets through combat quite well, and you can say the same for Kaboom, despite his large hitbox and low health, making him, far too easily defeated. But still, he gets through the battles, and that's what's most important about him. Fire is just such an incredible element without a single stinker to be talked about. I'm so passionate about that element. It's even incorporated into the channel name because it's that glorious. But with that all being said and done, this discussion is coming to an end. My throat is becoming rather hoarse right now with how much I've been speaking. So hopefully you guys have appreciated this video. Around being way longer than I was expecting, but that's what happens when you're passionate about something. You can talk about it for hours on end, just as I have done with all of you today. So I want to thank you all for watching up until this point in the video. I appreciate every last one of you and the incredible support you've been given. We are so close to 400 subscribers, and I could not be more proud of our progress. But anyway, tomorrow is going to be the final episode for this Sky Timber series. So until the moment arises, peace!
So for those of you who were paying attention to the video and actually read the description when I gave you the aesthetic to do so, it mentions about the fact that I completely forgot to talk about what made the Undead my least favourite element of Skylanders Imaginators. That just somehow fled my mind. So naturally, I am going to be tagging that information onto the end of this here video so that then you guys can be more informed as to why I think the Undead is the worst element of Imaginators, mind you. And it starts with Wolfgang. Now you might think that means that I dislike this character, when in truth, it's the complete opposite. He is the saviour of this element, the only thing that gives this element any semblance of quality, because Wolfgang here, he's really fast paced because his dashes are really quick and have little cooldown, and not to mention they knock back enemies so you can single them out with your speakers and your arrows, because then, you know, enemies are taking damage from the speakers, your arrows, and the arrows being shot out by the speakers. That's like 4 times damage every single second. He is broken, he is powerful, and he is fast paced too, making him a really fun character to play as, and one that's really efficient in combat too, because enemies can't get close to him considering he's defeated them within 5 seconds with his speakers and his arrows alike. So he's not a weak link here. The other two are, starting with, of course, Pit Boss. First of all, his creature isn't unique in the slightest, because when comparing him to Cobra Cadabra and Rattleshake, he has nothing over his characters. He's not a swapper, he hasn't got a basket and uses mini snakes and has any sort of rhythm to his music like the other two, so he has the same creature design, but a much more lackluster moveset in comparison, making him very generic and forgettable when he's blended in and compared to other Skylanders, mind you. So naturally, he's not nearly as powerful as he needs to be a sensei, so he's nerfed in comparison to the rest of them, and he's just not all that interesting either, not on a design level, nor on a gameplay level, but at least he's well textured. That's my favourite thing about this figurine right here. I love his little serpent robe right here, and how, you know, you rub your finger along and it feels like scales. That's very cleverly done. But finally we move on to Chopscotch, who has interesting moves. You know, she's well animated, and you know, the fact that she's slamming down a very powerful axe on enemies, a giant one at that, is very satisfying to cause such destruction. But unfortunately the rest of her attacks aren't very good. Her head projectile is never utilised by me because it's so nerfed in comparison to the rest of the moves, so I might as well just use the rest of those moves, because, you know, I can use the spin and knock back enemies, but you lose a lot of the agility, momentum, really making this character slow paced. And not to mention, her design is also quite lackluster. She's literally just an orb with a giant axe and a ponytail. Didn't take many brain cells to come up with that. Like, sure, it's detailed. I love the small little increments on her skull right here. But the detail isn't enough to make the design feel fresh and creative. So naturally, that's why Undead is my least favourite Imaginators element. Sorry I forgot to talk about that in the moment, but hey, that's what I have editing for, so I was able to edit this clip onto the end of that video right now.